You know what? I've got to grab my. Welcome to Hudson Institute. I'm Arthur Herman, Senior Fellow and Director of the Quantum Alliance Initiative. And I'm very pleased to welcome you to what I think you're going to find to be a very engaging dialogue that we're going to be talking about the current and future state of 5G technology, about where it's going, where it is, and in particular, where the US is with regard to 5G technology in relationship to the country that has emerged as the #1 global player in this technology, namely China, and in particular, the company, Huawei, which has emerged as the colossus bestriding the world, as you'll see, almost literally bestriding the world with regard to this advanced wireless technology. And as part of, and in order to get launched in this discussion and to talk about the different aspects of it, and you'll see there's many different levels and dimensions to talking about an advanced technology like 5G, it's been my pleasure to welcome back to our dais, Declan Ganley. Declan is currently Chairman and CEO of Rivada Networks, which is a telecommunications company specializing in the efficient use of wireless spectrum with patented technologies. He's a leading wireless entrepreneur. He's been awarded spectrum licenses and deployed wireless networks in 10 countries. He's an outspoken advocate for US and Western leadership in the 5G and cyber domain. And as you'll see, that term outspoken will turn out to be, in fact, a very accurate prediction. If you've heard Declan in other forums or in the media, you'll know exactly what I mean. And when we talk about 5G, I think before we start talking about the implications for the competition between the US and China in this technology, I think it's important for us to do a quick look at just what it is that makes 5G 5G. What is this advanced wireless technology that makes it so special, that makes it, as so many experts have said, the next big thing for the 21st century? And so, Declan, I'm going to start the discussion by asking you to fill in for us as a wireless entrepreneur, as someone who has watched the evolution of third generation or 3G, fourth generation, 4G, and now fifth generation, 5G wireless technology. What is it that makes this so special and makes its development so significant? I think for a lot of people, when they read the media, the thing that they find out is, hey, with 5G, I can download movies from Netflix, in seconds. Isn't that exciting? Well, it is very awesome achievement and obviously very useful, but it really goes a lot farther than that, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, the popular sort of view at the moment in media is it's much faster, and it is, spectacularly faster than the connections that we currently enjoy on 4G and on 3G. But this is a change. I heard it put it this way in Japan. It's like moving from the typewriter to the computer. It's a huge leap. It's not just another generation of wireless technology. It is a massive shift in the way that the economics of wireless and of technology are going to work. If you think about all of the things that we would not have were it not for 4G and 3G technologies, the whole so-called gig economy wouldn't exist without it. There would be no Uber or Lyft or so many other things like that. The changes that are going to come with 5G brought about by vastly increased speeds, but also vastly increased capacity. So for example, in a football stadium, right now, we've all been there, you're at a racetrack, a football stadium, you're trying to send a message, even send out an email, far less look at a video. It's not going to happen for you unless you happen to be very, very lucky and have managed to get a connection on the cell in the football stadium. With 5G, the experience of being able to look at video on your handset in a football stadium becomes a reality, that vastly greater numbers of people will be able to access service off the same sites at the same time. The other effect that we're going to see in 5G, and the industry hasn't worked out the economics of this yet, and it's quite frightening to them, is that the economics all change, that the world in which we have existed in the wireless industry, really from the advent, from 1G, from the pre-GSM days to now, is going to change. Up until now, we have had a retail focus model where you went out to the end consumer was your customer, they paid you a monthly amount of money for their usage, and that was the world everybody lived in. 5G destroys that business model. We are going to have to find completely new ways of pricing and selling 5G. We see existing operators wrestling with that right now. Are they going to become media companies? Are they going to become gambling companies? Are they going to become something else? I think we are on an inevitable path where we're going to see a separation of retail, the retail-consumer relationship, and the provision of capacity relationship. That is a renting that has to happen. And the fact that it hasn't happened is what, frankly, Beijing has so brilliantly played over the course of the last 2 years, as we've seen Huawei and ZTE both build footprints across the world, facilitated by retail mobile carriers struggling to find a new business model.
And dig a little deeper into the history here, but one more remark about 5G. So the real key for 5G isn't necessarily speed or even decreased latency, right, in terms of delay of signal. It's really about connectivity. Things are going to connect which weren't possible to connect in a wireless way before, with much more capacity to move and transmit data and to build those kinds of connections.
While the speed and capacity, those are both true and those will all happen, you've put your finger on it. The big shift is going to be what you can do with this. The fact that you will be able to have devices that can connect at maybe 2 cents a year in an off-peak time in a rural area that will report back soil temperature data to trading platforms that want to calculate what the price of soybeans is going to be in 6 months from now. The thing is that soil temperature monitor has not got a business case at $30 a month, which is what a carrier would, or maybe even at $5 a month. It just doesn't have a business model. At 2 cents a year, it will have a business model. We're going to see massive changes like that, but to see those changes, to liberate 5G to its full potential, we have to allow price discovery to take place on capacity, and I think that's coming soon.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about ways in which to do that in a little bit later. The thing I wanted to do, though, is pin down for our audience about where this development is. So the key to 5G isn't the fact that it's some sort of magic. They don't have some secret sauce that's embedded in the technology that makes 5G possible. It really is a development that comes, it's a leap from where we were with 3G and 4G. But the 3G and 4G, and we look at our phones, right, which right now are depend upon 3G and 4G, right, technology by way of how we connect,
right,
whether it's to the internet or with each other or on the phone or by messaging and so on. With 5G, it's not going to be just your phone that's going to connect.
No.
It's going to be your car. In fact, really, isn't it true that driverless cars, we talk about the future of driverless cars, it's not going to be possible without 5G to move the huge amounts of data that is going to be required for all of your sensors, for all of your AI capacity in order to make driverless cars a reality and to be able to run them through cities, streets, and in city traffic. So from the point of view of driverless cars, from the point of view of smart cities, politicians talk about, we're going to have a smart city powered by AI. No, you won't if you don't have 5G capacity in order to move and to keep that capacity going.
It's very true. I mean, it'll be everything from your car to your can of Campbell's soup. I mean, the connectivity of most of our economy is going to exist and touch the 5G economy. It's going to be that significant. Most of our economy, all of our infrastructure, all of our utilities, all of our logistics will exist in this 5G environment.
And that means you're going to have an enormous impact both from an economic standpoint, as you've just mentioned, but out of that will also come issues of not just economic interest, but national interest. And the question of then, when you have an advanced technology of this kind, which is going to be developed and the architecture is going to be provided by a country or by a group of companies, who that country is and who that company is can be very significant, can it, over the future of the development.
Pivotal.
And for example, 3G was largely an American development, which is why American telecom companies were able to rise to the top and be so dominant in the world marketplace today. 4G, correct me if I'm wrong, originally developed as a European development, and the US had to scramble to catch up and eventually was able to sort of take the lead with 4G. So with 5G, the question of first mover advantage, of who's the dominant player, is going to arise again. And where are we right now, in your opinion, in terms of where that discussion is?
Well, I want to come back to a couple of things you said about 3G and 4G, because some very interesting things happened during that. This is a long fuse that we've been watching to get to 5G. 3G and 4G were absolutely shaped by innovation developed in the US and in Europe. Back in the days pre-3G, and as we went into 3G, we had Lucent Technologies, we had Alcatel, we had Ericsson, we had Nokia, and we even had Nortel Networks. All phenomenal, and Siemens was even a player back in those days. As we went through each iteration, we had a reduction, a shrinkage in the number of Western providers of these solutions. So we lost Nortel early. We lost Lucent Technologies. It was merged. We lost Alcatel a couple of years ago, or very recently anyway. And now we're left in the West with Nokia and Ericsson and also Samsung to a degree. And we've seen the rise of new players in particular, and players that have postured themselves very aggressively, Huawei from China and ZTE also from China. But the other thing that we did, and one of the reasons that we saw the shrinkage in the pool of alternatives in the West, is that we had these one-off spectrum auctions. So they really started with 3G at the end of the 1990s and early 2000s, where the 3G license auctions in Europe soaked so much capital out of the private sector and into the public sector, into government coffers, that it really crippled the industry in Europe at that time. It took billions off the table that otherwise would have been invested into infrastructure and deployment, and really slowed down the rollouts of those 3G networks in Europe. The prices that were paid in the US were not as high for those licenses. So our spectrum policy, more than anything else, is what has shaped how much competition there's been, the number of players that they've been, and what we inadvertently did, and this was never the plan, and you can't blame the carriers for this, is by having these one-off spectrum auctions and having carriers write massive upfront checks for what were effectively monopolies over those tracts of spectrum, we crippled carriers with debt. If you look at AT&T, it's the most indebted non-financial company in the world. Okay, it bought Time Warner and did some other things. But if you look at the characteristics of these carriers all over the world, not just here, they're all massively indebted companies because they've overpaid in spectrum auctions, and then the price has been paid in slower innovation and slower rollouts than we otherwise would have seen for all of these generations of technologies.
And this is happening with 5G. And it's the opportunity for China to step in a very big way into this area.
So I have to say that I've said this publicly, I'm an admirer of the generalship of the Huawei CEO. I don't admire the country, the system that Huawei to me represents and where it's coming from, and that it's answerable to the Communist Party of China. I don't think they have anything very positive to offer the world at all. So my view is colored in that regard. But the generalship of Huawei has been phenomenal. They saw a flaw in the Western model, which is that we have all of these massively indebted retail mobile carriers with a broken business model, all strapped up to their eyeballs in debt, all needing to pay for 5G spectrum if it was going to be sold off in these one-off auctions, and all needing to deploy equipment, the 5G technology after the fact. So what happens?
It's a big infrastructure project.
It's massive. And by the way, this is not a perfect measure, but by and large, if you're deploying 5G, think about it as about 10 times the number of sites, at least, that you need compared to 4G. And if you go up into the millimeter wave spectrum, which the US is doing at the moment, you're talking about many more numbers of sites than that. But anyway, it's more sites. So there's the amount of money, of cash that you have to spend on infrastructure is even greater for 5G than it was for 4G or for 3G.
And if you're cash strapped, capital strapped, as a lot of these telecoms are, you'll be very thankful for someone else who steps up and said, I can solve this problem for you.
Well, I'm going to tell you of one example I know of in Europe. I know of more than one example, but I'm going to give you this particular one. I'm not going to name the company and embarrass them because I was told this by 2 of their board members. A company in Europe with 5G spectrum to deploy in this particular country. Huawei came to them in this case and arranged 115% vendor financing. That's 15% more cash than you need to write the check to them. 30-year terms, 0% interest. Who wouldn't take that deal? Everyone would take that deal. And the offer that the Chinese vendors have been able to make in terms of vendor financing blows everybody else out of the water. There has been this, and this is a myth that has been established through by repetition. It is common knowledge that Huawei technology, 5G technology, is better than Nokia or Ericsson technology. Not true. Just not true. But what happens is that the C-suite of these mobile carriers in Europe and elsewhere they need to justify this. So the CFO needs to say the Huawei technology is better. Yes, of course we need Huawei because it's better. And it just so happens that, yes, it's 50% less than the other guys or 40% less than the other guys. And yes, we happen to be able to get 100% or more vendor financing for it. The real reason that they're getting deployed is because they're getting cheap vendor financing. That's backed by Beijing and by the Chinese government. And the reason that they are doing that, and this isn't a conspiracy theory, we don't have to speculate about this, they've told us. It's because of the Digital Belt and Road Initiative, the China 2025 objective of dominating the cyber domain by 2025. And so we see, as you have seen and you've pointed out, Arthur, country after country falling for this, where the mobile, it's not the government. So it isn't, an envoy doesn't arrive from Beijing to say, Mr. Prime Minister, we would like you to deploy Chinese-supplied 5G technology across your country. Because, of course, immediately that's going to raise some heckles, right? No, that's not what happens. What happens is they go to strapped mobile phone carrier who's already massively in debt. They say, would you like the soft vendor financing and heavily discounted technology? And that, by the way, if you take this, you're going to be able to bid more in your 5G license auction. And therefore, we're going to give you more room to win the 5G license auction. And then we'll deploy this on a turnkey basis for you. Would you like that, Mr. highly indebted mobile carrier. And by the way, try and get another bank to lend you the money to do this. They won't do it because your business model sucks, because you are running a retail-focused consumer business model that doesn't make any sense whatsoever in 5G, but you know what? We'll fund it for you. And that's how they're winning. And then those carriers are going in and they sit down with the Prime Minister. And when the carrier lobbyist sits down with the Prime Minister, it's a whole, I shouldn't say the Prime Minister, with the government, whoever it might be, that's a whole different prospect. Because perhaps they went to the same school together, they've known each other for years, they go to the same charity functions and so on and so forth. It's a different relationship. And what Beijing has brilliantly done to, in its objective of winning those China 2025 goals, the Digital Belt and Road Initiative, is they have used the distressed mobile carrier industry of the Western world as the Trojan horse, which has delivered 5G footprints for these Chinese vendors all across Europe.
Then this is exactly the point at which I became involved in this issue, because now here's something on my personal note. I'm not a telecommunications entrepreneur. I'm an historian turned policy analyst, and particularly someone interested in the relationship between national policy and advanced technologies. I became interested in Huawei going back to 2010 when I was working on cyber strategy and cyber deterrence issues, and the degree to which China had become a runaway offender in terms of cyber theft, in terms of intellectual property theft. And I was aware that many of those allegations about cyber theft and IP theft fell upon the head of China's largest telecommunications equipment maker, the world's largest telecommunications maker in the world, Huawei. So I became a little concerned about the fact that Huawei was emerging as a major player, and increasingly the major player, in this area of a critical technology of the future, namely 5G. And as I was working here in Washington to try and raise awareness of the threat that the competitive threat that China poses, not just in 5G, but across the advanced technology spectrum, from 5G to autonomous systems, to AI, to quantum technology, to robotics, that this fit into a pattern in which China was able to push ahead with a comprehensive strategy, even as the US was slow to awake to the threat and to the challenge and to do something about it. Now, I have to say, from my perspective, the struggles that I had in the second term of the Obama administration were very frustrating, because I found that no matter how much evidence you presented of the degree to which China was engaged in this strategy that involved very predatory practices with regard to cyber theft and IP theft, that the response was muted, to say the least. With the new administration, there was a new realization and awareness of that threat. But at the same time, there seemed to be a struggle in terms of what are we going to do about it, how do we deal with the problem, and where does 5G fit into the larger question of, for example, what I call predatory trade practices on the part of China with relation to the US. And so over the last year and a half, as I began to try to sound the alarm over what was happening with regard to Huawei's steady advance in the 5G territory, just as Declan has described, at the same time, I was aware that that juggernaut that Huawei had unleashed was not slowing down, was not being halted by US awareness of this, or even calls for, as happened last year, calls for a ban on Huawei equipment and an appeal to allies, but was in fact actually beginning to gain steam. And I thought it would be interesting for our audience, Declan, to walk them through a set of charts that we have prepared as part of our audience entertainment, showing, these are charts that were provided courtesy, by the way, of your team at Rivada Networks, showing the global reach of Huawei as it began to grow starting in September of 2018, when I think that it was becoming increasingly clear that this single company was now becoming the dominant global player in the development of 5G technology. And that country after country, company after company, was either signing a memorandum of understanding to test Huawei equipment for 5G networks and infrastructure, or was outright signing a contract in order to bring Huawei in as the contractor. Now, the first chart that we've got here, can you, you got them? And I think I've got them here too, is that it was in August of 2000, it was August 2018 that I published a full-length article in National Review called The High-Tech War with China, which really said that the high-tech arena had now become the most important arena of US and China competition for global leadership in the 21st century. I talked about 5G, but I also talked about quantum and AI and supercomputers and so on. Now, at the end of that month, by the end of that month, in September 2018, as you can see from this map, by then, Huawei had managed to sign up more than 45 countries with memorandums of understanding or with contracts in order to install Huawei equipment for 5G.
So pink is MOU, it's pre-deployment.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. The pink, which you can see very clearly here on this map, the pink represents the MOU, and it's the first step, right? They're stepping into the Huawei web by taking on the testing and evaluating of equipment. The red signifies absolute contract. They're fully in with Huawei and are now using Huawei at the same time. Now, when you look ahead just a month later, a little bit less than a month later, October of 17th of 2018, that was the same date, by the way, in which I published a column in Forbes.com on what I called the war for the world's 5G future. Again, as part of the effort to get the US government, to get the administration and Congress to say, we've got to take some serious steps here because Huawei is going to win if it keeps going at this pace. That was, by then, Huawei had added both the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, hey, a US ally last time we checked, as well as Lebanon to the grouping. By October, the end of October, the 29th, they had added Turkey, Afghanistan, and the Philippines. I also published a column that, as it happens, that day on America's 5G rendezvous with destiny. They're trying to invoke the shades of Franklin Delano Roosevelt again to say this is going to become a serious problem. It's going to be damaging to our alliances because so many of our, even NATO allies, were thinking about or actually signing up with Huawei in this process. And America had to take some concrete steps in which to bring this threat to a halt and to bring this all to an end. And then just a day later, October 30th, day before Halloween, they added the Republic of Korea to the list. Let's move ahead, check ahead to November, the end of November, November 28th, 2018. Again, I published another column, Declan. This one on the coming US-China showdown on the future of wireless. Right? So, what kind of impact was I having? Well, I'll tell you the impact I was having, and that is that by November, those number of countries that had signed MOUs or contracts had grown from 45 to 66. They should have been. You know, that occurs to me at the same time. Or others were sort of saying, Arthur, why don't you stop writing about the 5G thing? You seem to be giving a lot of momentum to Huawei in this process. It was just uncanny, the degree to which the more you sounded the alarm and so on, the more it doesn't seem to have any kind of impact, the response that was coming. It was clearly, and there was, in the part of the government, you will agree with me, you've talked to people and officials, you've spoken to, there were steps that were being taken. There was an effort, such as the Huawei ban, but clearly this wasn't being effective. This wasn't working. I couldn't do it by myself. And certainly the federal government was trying to step up, but they weren't stepping up in a way that was very helpful. Then we go to December of 2018. And where are we? Well, Japan has joined the ban. Japan, one of the countries which was willing to stick its neck out here and say, you know what, we're going to stand with the US and with Australia and New Zealand in banning Huawei equipment from and future 5G networks here. When other allies took an opposite position with regard to do with this, the Japanese had the courage to stand up and say, we'll support you on the Huawei ban and where this is going. Now let's skip ahead to March. March, a month after the Mobile World Congress in Barcelona, at which Huawei was able to trumpet its success in growing country after country, continent by continent, in terms of its development of its network of 5G contractors and MOUs here. And the columns that I wrote then at the beginning of March, directly afterwards, was really assessing, has the US effort that was taken at Barcelona to dissuade companies, warning them, this is a company with a long history of allegations about cyber theft and IP theft and equipment which may have back doors installed that allows Chinese intelligence and military to gain access to data and to control electronic devices here, and you're letting them in, you're letting them build your 5G. This was the plea that Americans were presenting, and the plea wasn't working. They weren't.
A bit of a downer. On the first day, they announced Spain. So, and it was in Barcelona.
It was in Barcelona.
It sort of went downhill from there.
Yeah, that was one in which I wish I had been the caterer for Huawei because they were able to put on quite a party.
They were in the former Olympic Stadium.
The former Olympic Stadium, as far as their sense of what Barcelona represented in terms of their global advance here too. Then by the end of March 26th, 2019, they'd added Sri Lanka. They had added Syria in the process, and then Peru by the end of August of 2019. And by then, as you can see from the chart, from those of you looking at the map here too, as you watch the steady march of pink turning to red and then white turning to pink, that by then 60% of Europe was in contract or MOUs with Huawei in the process, which is particularly stinging from the point of view of the United States and our policy and our dealings with Europe, to have them become part of the Huawei network.
And also, I would argue,
it too.
Europe has an awful lot more to lose, even than the US, from this. But we can touch on that.
And by the way, by then, my ability to sort of trumpet the alarm was somewhat muted, I should mention, because at that point, Huawei contacted my editors at Forbes and threatened them with a libel suit against my columns for talking about what Huawei had done in the past and the allegations that had been made about cyber theft and IP theft. I will say that for my Forbes editors, they did not stop my column as Huawei wanted them to do. They stood by me through it, but it was clearly a shot across the bow, saying that Arthur Herman's columns aren't helping our cause and in fact are spreading what they call disinformation about Huawei, and the need then to shut me up as part of what they needed to do in order to complete and push the triumph forward, particularly as a way of shutting off its ability to have effect on what was happening with the federal government and what was happening here. And if we talk about the case of Europe, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, by the way. When we look at the case of Europe, and we can see from this map, what's so significant is the progress from pink to red. That despite the US warnings, despite the call for alarm and sort of saying, you don't want to do business with Huawei, it's a big mistake. The transition from the pink to red, from just simply being halfway with Huawei to being all the way in, continues relentlessly through it. And it's even true, of course, too, when we look at the map for Asia, where we see the same kind of progression, the same development in which Huawei's position grows stronger instead of weaker, and in which its ability to manipulate telecom operators and even governments to become part of the Huawei network, the Huawei universe, and therefore China universe, is really quite striking and strike. Amazing to look at. And so when we look at it, step back and see where we were in 2018 compared to where we are 2019, the advance is pretty dramatic, isn't it?
It is.
I mean, look at it. Total deployment contracts from 18 in 2018 to 40 in 2019. Total MOUs from 49 growing up to 56. And there doesn't seem to be, in many parts of the world, much that's going to stop that again from shifting from pink to red, from MOU to full.
There is one thing that can stop it.
Well, let me come back to that. What I just want to stress again how amazing this picture is, that we have a technology which the U.S. developed and created. We have one in which we have leading companies here who pioneered this technology, who are already establishing networks here in the U.S. right now for 5G, for testing and for evaluating this technology. And yet the big winner, the big global winner with all this is not the U.S., it's not U.S. companies, it's China. So the question has to come, which is, how did this happen? How could it be that number one, that China was able to move in so effectively and so swiftly here? And we talked a little bit about this because of the way in which they can offer, conditions that, it's an offer you can't refuse. We're giving you 115%, is that what it was? 115?
In this particular instance.
This particular instance, 115% credit on it. And also labor force too. The Chinese will throw in, hey, if you want people to build it, we'll build it for you as well. No worries on that front. Not only how it is that China was able to develop this, but why have we been so ineffectual in being able to stop the Huawei Express and to bring this and to reverse the controls on the momentum and direction that we're seeing around the world?
Well, the reason is that our governments have allowed themselves to suffer from regulatory capture by a heavily indebted legacy industry of retail mobile carriers. With respect to those of you that are in the room from those carriers, I'm sorry to have to say it, but it is true. The retail mobile carriers around the world have been trying to do one thing: protect price. Keep the price of capacity keep it as high as possible, and certainly make sure that price decline is not too rapid. And with rapid price decline comes squeezed margins, and when you have squeezed margins in a company that's seeing a price decline of its main consumer product, what you end up with if you have a massively indebted company is a distressed debt situation. And distressed debt means debt renegotiations with bondholders, and it generally means that quite often the senior management teams of those companies end up finding themselves not being employed in those companies anymore when these companies are forced through these massive restructurings. So the brilliant play by Beijing to achieve their China 2025 goal of dominating the cyber domain globally has been to use these debt zombies that are retail mobile carriers all over the world to be the vehicles which deliver China's 5G infrastructure and technology throughout any of the countries that they're occupied in. And one of the amazing things to watch, Arthur, over the last few months is if we take, for example, the UK or Germany. Now, the UK is a good case in point. So a lot of you in here, probably all of you in here, have read the stories that the UK has not yet made its decision about whether or not it's going to allow 5G deployment, right? You've heard that. Yes, and now there's a general election, so it's been... they lost it. Gavin Williamson, the defense secretary, had to resign over a leak to do with Huawei, and the decision was going to be for Huawei, and then it wasn't, and this defense secretary resigned, and huge drama around this Huawei thing, and they've postponed their decision.
If you want to learn more about that, you can read another one of my Forbes.com columns on May 13th, which is why Theresa May must go, which gave the background about all of these developments that were underway.
Yeah, he's been the chronicler of what's gone on, no doubt about it. It's amazing. So Boris is now running and may win the general election, probably will, and we're all waiting for this decision. Well, guess what? The mobile carriers have already made the decision for the British government. They're deploying Huawei 5G throughout all of the major cities of the UK right now. They've been doing it since June. The carriers in Germany have been doing exactly the same thing. So while this debate we're hearing is still going on in the Bundestag, the carriers have been deploying Huawei 5G throughout all of Germany and throughout all of the UK. They don't care. Now, what does that tell you? It tells you that the carriers are so confident in their regulatory capture, so confident that they know that no government will dare make them overturn their deployments or rip and replace that equipment. That takes huge appetite for risk or something else if you're deploying before your government has made the decision. That's happened in Germany, it's happened in the UK. And that facts on the ground strategy is brilliant. Now the thing is who's paying for that? So EE's deployment of Huawei in the UK. If Boris Johnson, if he's Prime Minister next time, says, okay, we're going to implement a Huawei ban, no Huawei for 5G anywhere in the UK. Now, what are EE going to do? EE's shareholders and its board and its CEO are going to have to rip all of that stuff out. Are they going to eat the loss? Or is somebody else financing the loss and saying, you deploy it anyway, and if that bet backfires, we'll eat the loss. Now, I'm an entrepreneur, I'm a businessman. I bet you it's more like the latter. I bet you that the loss won't be theirs if there's a ban, which tells you how core this is of a strategy to create facts on the ground that become irreversible. In Germany, this has become real hardball in Germany. So I'm reliably informed, and this has not been said publicly before, that on the recent German trade mission, which was before the French one, a few weeks ago, to China, that it was made crystal clear to Chancellor Merkel that if Chinese vendors did not get a minimum of 40% of the 5G build in Germany, there would be direct tariff consequences for German exporters to China, the auto sector. And if you look at the news today out of Germany, you will see members in the Bundestag from Saxony, from Bavaria, where the auto industry is, Volkswagen, Audi, BMW, lobbying like blazes to allow Huawei 5G and Chinese 5G into Germany. They are harnessing all of these points of leverage against the German. So you've got the German intelligence services who've let it be known. I mean, you can read this in the newspapers. They do not want this to happen. The foreign minister has come out against it. Yet Merkel doubled down at the beginning of this week saying, no, I'm not going to ban anybody. And then last week, you saw President Macron, the first leader of a major Western country to come out and call this exactly as it is.
I want to talk about that for a second, and we're going to come back to the Macron example. But think about this fascinating contrast where you have, very close allies. In fact, we have what is usually called a special relationship with the Brits, don't we?
Yep.
In which we have a critical decision for U.S. and I would argue for global security being made that goes against the U.S. direction. Think about the contrast with that with, for example, a country like Japan, in which Japan, I think, really has stuck its neck out with regard to the Huawei ban. It has strong, economic ties, God knows, to China. It has as much at stake in terms of where it wants to be in terms of lowering costs for building 5G infrastructure. And yet they have been willing to sort of say, we're going to take the stand with the US and take the stand with Australia about this. It's a very, very interesting, and I know that it is a matter of concern to Japanese officials as well to see Europe in this position of, in a sense, sort of rolling over for Huawei and for these contract arrangements. I think you've done a very good job of explaining how that process unfolds, namely that a lot of the work is done beforehand. Now let's talk about France for a second, because what we've got this week from President Macron was an indication that maybe France isn't going to do the rollover that Germany and UK have done.
He said something it was in an interview that he did with The Economist, and actually it's behind the paywall on The Economist. It's not even in the print version, but there's a much more in-depth section on 5G, which didn't make it into the print version. It references the 5G stuff, but it doesn't go into the detailed part of the interview. But in it, he says that governments have outsourced national security decisions to the mobile carriers, and that these mobile carriers do not care about national security. It's not their role to care. They care about their bottom line, and they want to deploy this Chinese equipment because they don't care about national security. And it's the first time a Western leader has publicly, I know other Western leaders know this, but it's the first time that it's been publicly stated by a Western leader that this is what's going on, which was great to see. You know, back to your point just for a moment about Australia, Japan, etc., because the UK is the first country that broke with the Five Eyes on this issue, the so-called Five Eyes Intelligence Sharing Alliance, under very serious warnings, as far as I understand it, from their allies.
That's right.
And frankly, I mean, it was much harder for Australia to implement a Huawei ban than it was for the UK. Australia's got a lot more to lose. They've got enormous trading relationships with China. They're in that region. The UK allowed itself to be captured, or has so far, and it can reverse this, but the fact that it is betraying the Five Eyes Alliance on this thing, the fact that EE and Vodafone, British Telecom, has got more clout with the British government than Australia, New Zealand, the United States, Japan, it's
astonishing.
It's not the world I grew up in.
No, I don't think it is. In fact, you know, one of the things that I have been talking about, because I do a lot of work in Japan and on defense trade and in technology cooperation. I have to say, one of the stance that Japan has taken, and UK backing out, being shall we say, more than just ambiguous about this, is just one more argument for why I have said Japan should be the sixth eye. Why Japan is part of an intelligence network. You look for proof that you can trust this country, that we're together on these things. And I think Japan's position with regard to 5G is certainly an indication that they understand what's at stake, and they're willing to take a risky position. You talk about, again, the issue, because the danger with the Huawei ban is if not enough countries join, if there isn't a critical mass behind it, is you're going to become isolated from the rest of the world,
and this is the
which is going to be signed up as well. And that, too, I know is an argument that I've been confronted with by European representatives and others about why they're going with Huawei. They don't want to be left behind at the station when the Huawei Express pulls out and becomes the 5G network that the rest of the world uses.
There was a meeting with a European Prime Minister. I'm not going to name the country or the Prime Minister. It's a smaller European country. I heard this, as they say, from the horse's mouth, from the Prime Minister, in a meeting that I had with that Prime Minister in the last few weeks. This Prime Minister has opened an initiative. It's not in public, but with some other countries in Europe to take a particular approach to 5G deployment, very akin to the approach that you've been advocating in your articles, Arthur. In fact, almost identical to the model that you've been advocating, which is a wholesale type of approach. The diplomatic activity and pressure was started to be mounted on that Prime Minister, culminating very recently, I mean within the last couple of weeks, in a meeting where at the end of this meeting, which was ostensibly about a big Chinese investment in this country, one of the people asked the Prime Minister if he could have a word in private after the meeting. And the Prime Minister agreed. And this individual said, I have a message for you from Beijing. And the Prime Minister said, well, what do you mean Beijing? The town? Or what? And this sort of thing went on 3 times. And the person said, from Beijing. He knew what he meant. And he said, do you think, you are the Prime Minister of country, do you think that you are going to stop China's destiny in the 21st century? He then went on to say that look at what's going on in Germany, look at the UK, they're going with us. Don't be distracted by Poland, they're playing both sides. This is what this guy said. I mean, he's obviously trying to cajole the guy. He said, yes, they're doing a wholesale thing, but they're also working with us on we're going to be allowed to deploy. He said, he said, the Americans are either going to do a deal with us, Trump's going to do a deal with us, or he's going to be gone. And then where will you be? You will be isolated. He said, tell us what you want, do the smart thing for your country, and work with us. Now that was a personal message delivered to a Prime Minister. I've left a little bit of it out, which would make your hair stand on end. I'm not going to add that piece in there that was said. But these guys are playing for keeps. They understand the stakes. They saw an initiative that had started. And so much so, I mean, how determined do you have to be to send somebody in with a message like that? Now, you can question, have I just made this up? I haven't made it up. That came from the horse's mouth in that person's office in the last couple of weeks. That happened. And that's indicative of the degree of pressure that is being mounted everywhere and the messaging that is being mounted everywhere about how serious this is. There is nothing more important to Beijing right now than capturing the cyber domain. There are 5 domains of conflict: land, sea, air, space, and cyber. By 2025, if this is not stopped, Beijing will have captured the cyber domain, and it will not be reversible. We're not going to be able to get it back. We will then be operating in a compromised environment. Doesn't mean we can't operate, but it's not going to be our ocean. It's going to be somebody else's ocean. It's a brilliant strategy, and a year ago, we could have stopped it. Today, we possibly can stop it. But if we don't do something drastic almost immediately, this is inevitable. This is the way it's going to go.
Then let's talk about what we can do. Let's talk about what the options are by which we can take some of the wind out of Huawei's sails, if I may use an older nautical metaphor for describing this, and what the options are where the U.S. can grab back some of the leadership. And by the way, I think the thing that we both agree on with regard to this is that this is not just about U.S. leadership. It's about Western leadership. Because in the end, protecting the cyber domain from a totalitarian country like China, that the ultimate stakes are about tyranny versus freedom. I mean, that's really why I'm here at Hudson working on advanced technologies, because I want to ensure that the advanced technologies of the future, including 5G, serve the cause of freedom, not the cause of tyranny. And by and large, throughout history, they've served both. And it's important, I think, to make sure that it serves freedom in 5G as a breakthrough. What other kinds of options? Now, you have one. It's a controversial one. We've talked about it, and I've written about it, and I have my own questions about it. But you have one that you see as an important way in which the U.S. can get back leadership. And this focuses on particularly the wholesale. Do you want to spend a couple of minutes on the wholesale model?
Let me back up and explain what's so smart about wholesale. What's so smart about wholesale is it drops the average price of capacity. And why does that matter? Why the hell would that make any difference to Huawei or to the Chinese? Because by dropping the average price of capacity, as you drop the average price of capacity and as demand goes up, so you've got that device that's connected at a fraction of $1 over the course of a year. So average price drops, consumption skyrockets. So you have billions of connected devices more than you have right now. That price drop
Which is going to happen with 5G.
which is going to happen with 5G, makes the most sense in a wholesale environment. You, as a carrier, you cannot possibly think of all of the uses that bottom-up uses that innovators are going to come up with to use your capacity. So by saying to them it's $30 a month or $15 a month or $60 a month, whatever it might be, this is the price, take it or leave it, you immediately cull all of the things that would have existed below that price point. And with 5G, most of those things exist below that price point. That's where most of the economic activity, if you're Friedman, your Hayek, or even your Keynes, they all get that. So that's where that economic innovation needs to take place. Banks know that, and banks will fund wholesale networks, wholesale-only networks, to be deployed. They can be funded through debt and through equity, and the markets are prepared to pay for these things, and as standalone projects. So you get a spectrum allocation, you privately fund and privately build out a wholesale-only network with a pure neutral operator. So it's not Google or Amazon or AT&T or Verizon or anybody. It's a pure neutral operator that says, here's raw capacity, you tell us what the price is, take it all of the time. If the price that you're prepared to pay us in downtown Washington, D.C. at 4 a.m. is $2 for the whole city, and you're the only guy bidding for it, it's yours for $2. You clear all of the capacity all of the time. By the way, the electricity markets in America have been doing this for over a decade, and they work very, very well. You would not have balanced power grids in America today were it not for wholesale electricity markets in America. About 70% of electricity in the US now comes through these wholesale markets. It's inevitable economically that this has to happen for capacity. So what we're currently doing is that has not yet happened because the vested interests in the UK, in Germany, and everywhere else, and in the US, they don't want that to happen. They don't want it to happen because they don't want the average price to drop. They don't want the average price to drop because that introduces risk and unpredictability. You don't know when demand is going to be so sufficiently grow that that average price drop doesn't affect your ability to service your debt. And if you're the most indebted company in the world, an average price drop looks like potential death. So rather than risk that, it's much cheaper to hire, be it in the UK, in Germany, because this applies everywhere. It's not just, certainly in the US as well. It's much cheaper to hire 50 good lobbyists to make sure that nothing happens to disrupt your existing model, the existing status quo. Let's call it nationalization. That's what they were doing with regard to wholesale in the US. Let's say it's nationalization. This is a government-owned, government-funded, taxpayer-funded network. No, it's not. It's not even remotely true. There's just actually nothing true about it at all. You know, the best lies to tell are the really big stonking ones that have no basis in truth whatsoever because they're the hardest to disprove. You know, you're from Mars. No, I'm not. Prove it. So we've seen this go on. We've seen it go on in Europe.
In fact, we know this because one of my colleagues here, General Robert Spalding, was in fact the victim of the effort to brand the development of a comprehensive 5G strategy as nationalization, and it really, in the end, cost him his job. If Rob were here as part of the panel, he's out of town, he could talk to you about just how that kind of distortion of the message can work.
So if you introduce pure wholesale networks, to make a long story short, they're financeable. The private sector will finance them. They're infrastructure projects. There's infrastructure funds all over the world sitting on billions and billions of dollars that want to invest in this, like they want to invest in good toll roads and everything else. Right. They know the demand is there. What's happened is you have regulatory capture all over the Western world that is slowing the ability and stopping the ability of this disruption to take place, and that for every month that that's delayed, they can keep propping up price, and they can keep limping along.
Right. Now, let's talk about this for a second, because setting aside the question of the economics of the model that you're talking about, and I'm hoping that in question time maybe we'll have some more exploration of that in detail. Setting aside that kind of question, even if you were to say, hey, we're going to create a wholesale market with part of our national spectrum, let's say out of the Department of Defense's spectrum, which has lots of it sitting about, and so on. How in the world is that going to have an impact on the way in which China and Huawei have been able to develop and build their networks around the world? In other words, what's the geopolitical payoff, Declan, for that kind of an approach?
So in the US, the world has settled on a block of what they call the mid-band spectrum for 5G, and that is the standard that everybody else is using in the world. In the US, what we're saying in the US is that we're going to use millimeter wave spectrum for 5G as the mainstay of 5G in the US, and that this is somehow going to be better.
And it's very much an argument that many companies that are involved in this, and that was in fact the second of the options about what is the US going to do, how do you regain leadership. One of them, which has been stressed very much, is, hey, we've got this enormous capacity now, capability to use the longer wave. And by the way, I've put up a chart for the audience of the differences between wave, the high band versus low mid-band sub-6.
But just to set aside the millimeter wave versus mid-band thing for a moment, okay? Mid-band is what the rest of the world is using. So some of the argument being made here is millimeter wave is much better, and the US is going to do millimeter wave, and I guess the rest of the world's going to copy that.
And they see how good it is.
Yeah. That's what's going to happen. It's not what's going to happen. This is Betamax versus VHS. You know, you can argue, yeah, maybe Betamax was better. Who cares, right? It's not the global standard. So the VHS of 5G is in the mid-band spectrum. That mid-band, and that's where the war for the cyber domain and 5G is going to be won or lost. It's not going to be won or lost in millimeter wave because no one else cares about millimeter wave. Now, the mid-band spectrum in the US mostly is held by the Defense Department. And it is used for various missions, radar and other things that are important missions. Now, the good news is that the technology exists now that you can share the same spectrum, you can occupy the same spectrum, but with various levels of prioritization depending on who the user is. So, for example, DoD has mid-band spectrum. It needs to keep its mid-band spectrum for its vital missions, and it does. It absolutely does need to keep it for its vital missions. But DoD could share that, allow that spectrum to be shared on a sub-priority access basis with a nationwide 5G commercial wholesale operator, for example. If you do that in the US, and that is the model that a model, not the only model, but a model that the US allows to proceed for 5G, it smashes the model that Beijing has bet the farm on. Because what wholesale does is it drops the average price and it increases the uptick in consumption. The fact that retail carriers around the world have been trying to keep this retail model has made them dependent on Beijing's subsidies. When you get rid of that dependence, you don't need them anymore. You can go to Nokia and Ericsson and Samsung and you can buy their stuff and you can get some vendor financing, but the infrastructure funds will give you the money. The debt providers on Wall Street and the City of London will provide you with the money. Now these deals are financeable because you're not putting that money and that infrastructure into business models that are obsolete and that are struggling to service the massive debt piles that they've already got on their books.
I understand, but Declan, let's face it. How likely is it that governments in Europe, for example, like Spain or like UK or like Germany, who've been afraid to buck their telecom operators up to this point, that they're going to buck them the next point by saying, okay, we're going to embrace the wholesale model because the Americans are giving it a go?
You know, it's an interesting question. So Macron has shown that he's indicating he is prepared to buck something. So one of the big French wireless entrepreneurs who's got a network in France and in a few other countries, got a network in Ireland, where I have a home. So he has deployed Huawei in Ireland, but he hasn't deployed it in France. So, you know, they're playing around the sides. About 3 weeks ago, a Huawei site turned on. I can see it from the front door of my house. You want to talk about a red rag to a bull. This thing got turned on about 3 weeks ago in front of my house. Macron has shown leadership on this issue. Boris Johnson's been distracted. You know, he's had this Brexit thing going on, which is just like 110% of his time. Now a general election. He did make an interesting speech last year where he said something like, you know, the Americans were in charge of everything on wireless, and now the gizmos are all going to work on China's standard, and China have won this. He said that in a speech last year. I think it was at the Mansion House. He hasn't had time to focus on this, but this ultimately comes down to a...
You think it's possible to bring him around?
I do. I think that once, but nobody is going to be... Nobody now. I think if without Brexit, I think the Brits may have done this. They may even have done it on their own. It's possible that a country like Brazil could even still do this. But I think that at this point, now, the only way that you flip the table on China is if America takes the leadership position, shows the example, because then it makes it easy for everybody else to follow. Take that prime minister I mentioned earlier on, the guy that had the visit.
Right.
That guy wants to do this. So he's being squeezed, but he needs something that he can point to that he's following. Look, the Americans are doing this. They're doing this mid-band wholesale 5G solution. It changes the game. Huawei has no response to that. They could come in and say, well, we'll fund a wholesale network. Yeah, they can, but you know what? So will all these other guys. So they become unnecessary. The excuses for allowing Huawei in
what you're saying
gone.
is they're no longer indispensable.
And it actually makes a ban viable.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Now, there's another solution which has been bandied about, which is the virtualization of the 5G networks. And this is one which I've heard engineers from respected companies talk about in the process of developing what are, in a sense, virtual 5G, which basically would create almost a kind of, and correct me if I'm wrong, almost a kind of VPN within the 5G infrastructure. So you're not actually using Huawei infrastructure, but you're building a parallel screen-to-screen 5G in the process, and this is the way in which you get around the problem of what Huawei's doing.
Yeah, look, software-defined networks, virtualization. I mean, you know, my own boffins inside Rivada have told me, look, we could, you know, you could 3D print the device, put the electronics in it. You know, it'll cost you $80 to do it. Who's going to do this? I mean, that's not how big networks get built. This is more about the economics of how you finance these networks, even than it is about the technology.
Technology itself.
These are carriers don't, you know, in the glory days of AT&T of old, they had Bell Labs. They used to fly people in big helicopters, and you'd go and visit the labs, and they made the stuff. They made the phone. They made the handset. They made the wire that connected the handset to the phone. They made everything. And those days are over. I would say, thank God. Some may not. I mean, the days of a $200 phone call to Ireland are long gone, thank God. So everybody in the industry uses the same few vendors now. And the vendors come with financing, equipment, turnkey contracts, and an insurance bond to say, we will get this thing done for you. We will have it deployed in, you know, West Texas or East London or wherever it may be. And if we haven't got it done by such and such a day, our insurance company will pay you a great big check, and here's the insurance bond to get it done. And the equipment comes from all of those guys as well. The idea that we are going to get rid of the whole economics of how we provide the infrastructure. Ultimately, you can virtualize networks, but somebody somewhere is still got to climb up a pole or the side of a building and put a box that's got power connected to it onto the side of that building, so it turns raw spectrum into bandwidth.
Yeah, and I think this is one of my problems with the virtualization option too, is that one of the key arguments about Huawei coming in is that they're able to use or promise to use the legacy systems that were there to develop 4G. Someone's going to do something with those networks. Even if you virtualize, you have your own virtualized 5G network, there is still going to be another 5G network that's going to be built, and it's going to be operating, and it's going to be run by Huawei. And I guess that's my ultimate problem, is that it basically concedes Huawei's leadership and simply says, we're going to do something, do an end run.
It's the loser's mantra. It's the things that we can do after we have lost. I've talked about, we have to assume that we're operating in compromised environments. Does the US Navy say that? Why do we have to assume it? It's not even that expensive to get this right. The private sector will fund it. All we have to do is change the model, the way that we allocate spectrum and we allow it to be monetized. We don't actually have to write a check for $1 trillion to secure the cyber domain. The private sector will do it if we allow the model to be disrupted.
Well, now, the last option, then we're going to talk, that I'm going to raise, which is my option, and my interest is that you insist on developing a 5G standard which integrates quantum security. Quantum computers, the real next big thing of the 21st century, and its ability to break down public encryption, key systems, and the threat that it poses can be fully embraced and confronted through 5G. And there's all kinds of ways in which the technology that protects against quantum attack can be integrated into 5G in terms of quantum random numbers generators, but also in terms of quantum resistant algorithms. You can provide a basis for encryption, which Huawei and the Chinese won't be able to tap, and even more important, that they're not going to provide to their customers. Because Huawei is not going to quantum secure the networks it's building around the rest of the world because it wants to get into those networks. That's the whole reason they're building it, is to be able to have access to the data, to control and manipulate the information and the systems that are run off of those 5G networks. So if the US were to have a strong, robust, quantum secure standard in terms of the networks it's going to build and the networks that it's going to require from allies and others, and to be able to sort of say, we are able to provide you with this protection, not just now, but protection that's going to last you 20 or 30 years beyond it, I think the US can go a long way, this is my opinion, a long way in getting back the advantage on 5G and assuming the leadership. And that is a technological answer that supports and buttresses the financial arguments in favor of 5G.
And to have constantly maintained and upgraded quantum secure networks.
That's what you would have to do.
You need financially healthy operators that are pushing out vast amounts of capacity and selling it in a price clearing system. And you're not going to get quantum secure networks with the status quo as it exists at the moment because they haven't got the money to pay for them.
Well, that's one of the things I think that needs to be addressed. And here I think the question of where are the US telecom operators? My view is they need to be part of the solution, and they can be, and that they will be, going forward with the proper kind of political leadership. And I guess in the end, Declan, when I look at this situation, I see it as much as a matter of political leadership as it is a question of what kinds of financial models we follow, or what kinds of technologies we integrate, or what kinds of technologies we exclude. And this gets us back to the very reason I chose the title for this discussion, America's Darkest Hour or Its Finest Hour, right? The parallel with Britain. The darkest hour, right? Are we in 1940, in which we are besieged here while the rest of the world is going to be dominated by Huawei and China? Or is this perhaps our finest hour, the hour in which the US leader is able to regain leadership, turn the tables, including bringing our allies along, and turning what seemed to be an inevitable Chinese victory, a Chinese destiny, into instead a part of America's continued continued support for advanced technology as a pathway to freedom, as opposed to a pathway to servitude.
I fully agree. This is now a political leadership question. There are a number of political leaders that could do this. Macron is one, Merkel is another, Boris Johnson, if he's Prime Minister, is another one, but Trudeau could potentially do it. But the one where it would be the most effective and where it would flip the table globally is right here in the United States of America. And the political decision that would need to be made would take about 2 weeks to implement. There are enormous vested interests that will be opposed to this. There are thousands of jobs just in this city that exist on the basis of the swamp that is funded by these vested interests. You said earlier on that actually the telcos in the US need to be part of the solution. They definitely can. They're the biggest holders of spectrum. They could do this too, but they're not going to be the ones to do it first. You know, the tradition is sort of the golden rule of industrial relations. Innovation generally doesn't come from comfortable incumbents. It just doesn't. It should, but companies do not destroy their own business models. Disruptors destroy business models, and then incumbents adapt and build themselves anew, and that's what's going to have to happen. So we have a question that we have to ask ourselves in the West. Are we in the business of protecting the status quo and protecting incumbency, or are we in the business of disruption, and a disruption in this case that flips the table on the Chinese juggernaut, which looks unstoppable right now, but actually is not unstoppable. It can be stopped.
Should we take some questions from the audience?
Please.
What I'd like you to do, if you've got questions, is to wait for a microphone to be brought around to you. And then when you ask your question, and I stress the term question, as opposed to other types of utterances in our discussion, if you could also give us your name and also your affiliation, or whatever affiliation you care to disclose in the course of the discussion. Why don't we start with the questions up for the front, and then we'll circle back and work our way around. 1, 2, 3 in front. We'll start here, then then 2 here.
Hello, Chris McRae, Norman McRae Foundation. Wanted to go back to something you said near the beginning, which, if I understood correctly, you said, you know, a lot of things are bust because of the spectrum auctions and things, and if one could make the leap forward to imagining a world where you could have 2-cent rentals, you know, in agricultural fields, it sounded as if huge advantages for all sorts of climate and sustainability goals if we can get beyond all of this. So I think my question to you is, if China didn't exist, would 5G have slowed down or never got there, or would we be getting there faster? I mean, how do we get to the world where we get the human benefits from all of this, which I think we all want, without all of the other things getting in the way?
Interesting question.
Yeah, it is a really interesting question. Would 5G exist were it not for China? Not yet. The reason it wouldn't exist is...
Does it exist because of China? I mean, most of these countries right now don't really have 5G networks.
No,
they're simply, they're waiting for the Chinese to start laying down line.
They are. And 5G could not exist in the retail mobile environment in terms of nationwide rural coverage. Yes, it'll exist in cities and in city centers and in football stadiums, but will it operate out in rural America? No. It wouldn't. Interestingly, what we have seen is that carriers globally have actually not wanted innovation to happen too quickly. Because when you go out and you write a massive, this is why Europe was behind the US in some of these deployments. So you write the great big check up front for the spectrum, then you deploy the equipment. You don't want Ericsson coming to you next year saying, now you should upgrade to the next, fantastic thing. It's like, whoa, take it easy there, buddy. Come to us the year after next. Let's talk, right? We need to sweat this asset and make it pay for itself so that we can get back the money, not only that we paid you for your new gizmo, but also that we paid for this spectrum that we wrote a great big check to the government for.
You want technology to advance by discrete stages, not by leaps.
Right. And so, Huawei didn't have enough of the market where they cared about that. Also, this was not I believe this was not a commercial mission for Huawei. No. It was a geostrategic military mission to dominate the global cyber domain. They didn't care what it cost or how much they had to subsidize it by. If you're trying to establish naval dominance, you're not trying to look at the cost-benefit analysis of an aircraft carrier. Okay, it's about power projection and dominating the strategic domain. So without China, no, I don't think things would have moved along as quickly. Now, I have to say, Ericsson and Nokia 5G technology, which is the 5G technology I know particularly well, it's good. It's very good. They're way ahead of Huawei in certain aspects. Huawei are good at in parts of it as well. But the idea that Huawei are better than them is just not true.
And this also raises a point which we can't emphasize enough from the point of view of, are we at a point of no return? And that is, when we look at the map with the pink and the red, these represent in almost every case promises to build and promises to deploy. These are not actual networks which are up and running.
Those are easier to reverse.
And so that makes it possible. What you have is Huawei's promises, we're going to build the infrastructure, we're going to lay out the fiber optic, we're going to build the towers and put in the equipment and maintain it. But what we're in a position now is to get others to sort of say, you know what, this is not the contract that we had thought or had wanted, or this is thank you for the memorandum of understanding. We're going to go in a different direction.
If you look here at this map that's up there now, that's September 2018. India is blue. India had a ban in September of last year. It's now pink and it's nearly red, and that debate's going on right now. So
that's right. Yeah. So what we're doing is we're trying to shift the direction. Yeah. Shift the direction of the flow in terms of where Huawei is and where US and the West is. Now we had two questions here in the front, and then we'll work our way back. One here.
The initial discussions, is this one?
Name again, if you don't mind.
Bruce Guthrie, retired bureaucrat. The initial discussions talked about how basically businesses acted on misguided short-term interests, screwed up things. In Trump America, we're not really surprised about this sort of thing. But how do you deal with people who say, well, you're just doing sour grapes? U.S. was in charge of this, you no longer are, and that's the only reason you're opposed to China is because you're kind of whining about it. How do you make this really important other than a sour grapes type thing?
You want to take it?
Sure.
Then I'll have a shot.
I would say it would be like saying it's sour grapes if China controls all of the naval power in the Pacific. Yeah, that's I would have some sour grapes over that. I wouldn't like that one little bit. I think the West. I know the West has made over 20 years mistakes strategically, particularly the way that we did spectrum auctions. I mean, think about how we did spectrum auctions. We have created an environment where the measure of whether or not a regulator has been successful is how much money they raise from spectrum auctions. That's like saying that the head of the IRS should be measured on their success by how much tax they took off Americans. That would be the measure. Maybe it is. I don't know. But I mean, it's a perverse measure of success that we shaped our institutions to be modeled around what was a flawed process. So those mistakes have led to where we are right now. Is it sour grapes to say that, look how communist China has brilliantly played this and built this footprint around the world by subsidizing infrastructure? No, it's not sour grapes. On a very personal basis, I can tell you, I mean, I went to the Soviet Union when I was 19 years old, and I saw how that system operated. And I realized when I saw it that Ronald Reagan was right, that it was the evil empire. And I had people that lived there tell me that it was. And I learned to really detest communism as a repressive, oppressive, tyrannical, dictatorial system. And I look at what's going on the campus of the Chinese University in Hong Kong the night before last, and I don't need somebody else to tell me that this is a tyrannical action, that this is oppressing human freedom. I don't trust communist China's anointed deployers of 5G technology that are going to be doing facial recognition and that are going to be running the vast majority of my economy, all of that information. I do not trust the Communist Party of China or their anointed providers of anything. I don't trust them because I believe their system is antithetical to human freedom. And therefore, that's not sour grapes. I have been anti-communist for as long as I can remember, with good reason. This is a system that they are sponsoring, and therefore I don't want this system anywhere in any free society, because I do not trust them that it will not be harnessed and used to suppress and slow down our freedoms. I mean, remember that kid that was in the Marriott hotels? He tweeted something about Tibet, and Marriott fired him. This was a kid that worked in America, because Chinese got onto Marriott and said, you've got some employee that's tweeting about Tibet, and, you know, get rid of him. They fired a kid in America for tweeting about Tibet. Can you imagine what they will do if we allow our systems to be operated this way? No, it's not sour grapes. It is my hunger and desire for freedom, something that I think most people of all of us in this room were brought up and formed to believe in. That's why I care about this.
No,
it isn't sour grapes.
And I'm glad Declan brought up the Hong Kong example, because after all, what was the great deal that was struck when Hong Kong became part of China? Was one country, two systems, right? And now what we're learning is that China's Beijing's word on that was not good. And what we're offering with 5G is one world, two systems. That's not going to last. If they control the main means by which we move communications and data around the world, including possibly the United States, because as more and more of the Huawei-dominated world becomes really using the Huawei's 5G systems, then it's going to be more and more difficult for the U.S. not to feel like we've got to move into this space. Otherwise, we are going to cut ourselves off. We have trapped ourselves with Betamax in the VHS world. That is, I think, the challenge that we face, and ultimately it's a choice about values. Now, unlike Declan, I haven't been an anti-communist all my life. I was very much a man of the left for a very long time. In my formative years and intellectual years, a man of the left. But then I saw what was happening, and I began to understand what the real differences were between freedom and tyranny, freedom and servitude. And I think to a large extent, part of our own blindness, and this is the case with America, and I think still is the case in Europe and other parts of the world, there was the feeling that because China was our ally against the Soviet Union, right, in the 70s and 80s, and was a crucial, in fact, ally in terms of dealing with the Soviet threat and Soviet resurgence in the 1970s, that China would, under its present regime, its present system, would become more like the West, that it would be part of the communist East. And I think what has happened is that the scales have fallen from people's eyes, and now we do realize that China is a totalitarian country, that the economic integration, and we could have a whole other seminar on this next hour, the economic integration with the West, which the US and Western countries have facilitated. let's always remember that China's rise and economic miracle was made possible because the West of the United States facilitated its integration into the global economic system, right? We did it for them. We really did. And the fact that that has not made them sort of more Western and has not led to a convergence of the two systems as so many of its advocates and adherents had supported in the West, but has now at this point only heightened the differences and the contradictions between the system in China and the system in the US, needs to make us think again about China's role in any kind of economic or technological sector, and in particular in the area of 5G, because it will be so indispensable and so valuable in the future. So I'm going to thank you for your question, because it has really given us both the opportunity to get this off of our chests and about why the deeper reasons why the 5G thing matters, not just in terms of national interest, but I think for both of us in a personal.
Love him or loathe him, Newt Gingrich has just written a book, just published a book called Trump versus China. And it's about much more than the title suggests. The title doesn't do it justice. But it really captures actually the essence of your question and puts it into, I don't know how many chapters it is, but there's, I think it's 15. Chapter 6 is all about 5G. And it puts it into the context of all of these other questions. But it's, if you get a chance to get Gingrich's book, Trump versus China, which, as I say, is about a lot more than the title suggests, read it. It's really a good read.
Let's not forget about the other questions. One to the front again.
Thank you. We've had a number of discussions here at Hudson publicly in the last 24 hours, and they've been very scary in terms of the Chinese exerting control over the whole world. And as Arthur has referred to tyranny, and that was very much on the mind of someone from the White House who was here and other officials who spoke to us. It was very upsetting. And I would like to know if under this economic, I understand the discussion this morning has been all about economics. I'm concerned about the political aspects of this. And I want to know if under the wholesale model, does China still have access to our data analytics? And will that lead to surveillance and all of these other things about them that we were so afraid of? I mean, we're talking here, I'm a cultural historian, about the disappearance of nation, about the laws of the sea going by the way. I mean, this is a very, very totalitarian opportunity that the Chinese are cultivating. And I don't think we're paying enough attention to that in this discussion or in our White House or in our Congress or anywhere else.
So do you mind if I take this? So I would say the efforts to gather data is that's never going to stop. But what we can do, I mean, it's like the efforts to control the South China Sea aren't going to stop. They've militarized the islands that they said they wouldn't militarize and everything else. What we're seeing here is sort of the cyber version of that, but writ across the globe, not just in the South China Sea. But if you control, and it is your stuff that's being deployed, if they're your ships, if they're your islands, think about 5G in that context. These wholesale networks would be completely free of communist Chinese-backed infrastructure. The reason that they would be free of them is because economically you don't need them. You can buy your stuff from the others. You don't need the massive subsidies from Beijing to be able to deploy your stuff. That's how you keep them free. Now, does it mean that those networks, and Arthur has pointed out that they should be quantum secure, does it mean that they won't attempt to be able to strip data out of those networks? Of course they're going to attempt it, but it's going to be much harder. The difference is we will be playing, the battlefield will be a battlefield where we define the boundaries rather than the boundaries being defined by somebody else where we're playing in their territory.
And look, we can really simplify things if we think about this in terms of standards, which is the next 5G conference that I'm organizing is on 5G standards. Think of standards the way one thinks as a railroad gauge, okay? So if you set, the country that sets the railway gauge, right, for the width of rails on which trains are going to run, right? if you are able to successfully set the railway gauge standard, then whose engines and boxcars are you going to buy, right? The ones that are built to the standard and to the gauge. Who is it who's going to maintain the railways and upgrade them over time, move them from steam to diesel? It's the one that sets the gauge. And this is really what we're engaged in, is the battle over, in a sense, the 5G gauge by which the world will become connected in the 21st century. And to have, I think, to have China be the one that sets that gauge, that sets that standard, as they will do if they build these networks on the scale at which they've promised to do. And if the United States is still trying to figure out what's our standard going to be here at home, let alone what is the standard that we'll be able to export and to successfully defend abroad, then we've lost the battle. You had a question to the back, 1, 2, 3, and then we'll come back here towards the front.
A question here. Gopal Ratnam, I'm a reporter with Congressional Quarterly. Question for Mr. Ganley. So the open access model, how does that help improve infrastructure in the rural areas? I mean, the access is only one part of it.
Right.
Someone still needs to invest in infrastructure, and who will do that? Second, you talked about the technology existing to share spectrum. Is that still in the labs, or has it been proven, or where have you proven that?
Technology to allow for sharing has already been integrated by both Nokia and Ericsson, and in fact, there is a version of that being done currently in AT&T's FirstNet network. But to your point about rural, the wholesale open access model helps rural for a few reasons.
This is a big concern in Congress right now.
This is massive. First of all, to do rural, you're not going to do rural with millimeter wave spectrum, because you need, with millimeter wave spectrum, you would need a site every 600 meters. Now, people will say to you, that's not true. You can get further with millimeter wave spectrum. That's true, but in a pencil beam. So you would be narrowing the beam to get further, so you don't get mobility in millimeter wave unless you've got sites 600 meters apart. And in fact, closer is better. So you need mid-band. You need this mid-band spectrum that in the US is largely held by the DoD. There's others, the C-band is okay and everything else as well. But most of that good mid-band spectrum that the rest of the world is using as its standard is in the DoD. The wholesale open access model would build out into rural areas and turn on that capacity, and then any operator, anybody could buy wholesale capacity on that. So take, if you were in the South, say C-Spire, an operator in the South, they could buy capacity on that network. Arthur Daniels Midland could buy capacity on it. John Deere could buy capacity on it. Comcast could buy. AT&T could buy. AT&T would say, we would never buy capacity on that network. But anybody can buy capacity on that network and use it to service whatever business model they may have. Now, it's going to drop the price. The average price in rural areas is going to be quite low because there's not as much demand. But the business case is there to build out those networks, and you can finance them, because I've run the models and I've done this with the banks and with the infrastructure funds, to cover the very high percentages of the geography of America, and certainly percentages of the geography of America that are currently not covered, because the existing business models will not allow those to be covered, because you're not aggregating demand. So AT&T, Verizon, and Sprint and T-Mobile don't all join together to build out sites. You're seeing this in other countries in rural America. Now, AT&T might have 3 customers, Sprint might have 1, T-Mobile might have 4, and Verizon might have 5 in a particular rural locale. But because they're not all the subscribers of one network, there isn't enough business there for any one of those guys to justify building out their tower. You aggregate that demand and you drop the price, you allow the price to be cleared at a lower price, and now you have a business case for rural build out. So aggregating demand's very important, Mid-band spectrum, you can't do it without mid-band spectrum. I mean, there was statements made here a few months ago that rural America would be built with using mobile coverage, and rural America would be provided using millimeter wave spectrum. Not unless you change the rules of physics, they won't.
Time for 2 quick questions, and then we're going to adjourn. I'm going to take the 2 over here.
Larry John from Answer. I'm just wondering if the solutions that you've outlined are necessarily exclusive of each other, or if there is a compromise path, if you will, that takes you through all of them so that you can start from one position and move forward.
No, they're not mutually exclusive. That's a very important point, and that's a misunderstanding that has existed, that what we were proposing was that this would be the only 5G solution. No, this would be a baseload 5G solution that would be there, but it's certainly not going to be the only 5G solution. AT&T and Verizon and Sprint and T-Mobile and Dish, everyone should be deploying their 5G networks. You want competition in every form and shape that it can take. Price is going to be one of those areas. Quality of service is going to be another. Coverage is going to be another. So let everybody press on. I think that what will happen is that the shareholders and activist shareholders in companies that own lots of spectrum are going to force those companies into extracting more value out of their radio spectrum by allowing that spectrum to be cleared into a wholesale marketplace. What they're going to try and do for the next few years is they're going to try and show that they can make money out of being in the movies, by being in gambling, and everything else, and that's not going to work, and then they're going to end up doing this. But we can't wait for that to happen to flip the table on the Chinese.
And with regard to quantum security, I think there the government simply has to take the lead and has to make this a requirement for future 5G networks and elsewhere. And because this is one in which customers won't see an advantage necessarily. Quantum, what's a quantum computer? Believe me, in 2 years, the discussion will be very, very different. And everybody will be concerned about how much their networks and data is going to be quantum secure. And for thinking about the future of 5G, that's going to be crucial. Then we'll have a question there, and then we're going to have to wrap it up.
With American Consumer Institute, thank you both so much for coming out today. My question was just regarding networks, different networks that you've built and ones that maybe you're building right now. I was just curious of where that is. Thank you.
Not sure I fully understand the question. Where are the networks that I've built? Is that your question?
Sorry, my question was on just your experience in building networks and ones that you have built and maybe building right now. Thank you.
So my experience in building networks, well, there's a couple of other guys in the room here that in the team that I have in Rivada, I've got the former CIO of Sprint. We've got the guys that have built out the Nextel network, a big chunk, a respectable piece of the AT&T network that played an active role in that, and other networks around the world. Personally, I bid for my first mobile phone license. I started working on that bid in 1994. So I've been in this business for a while. I didn't win it. It was in Ireland. It was awarded in 1995. I partnered with Comcast in that. I went on to found a company called Broadnet, and we ended up winning wireless LMDS licenses across 10 countries in Europe. I built out the top 42 towns and cities in Germany, the top 14 in France, Basel, Bern, Zurich, Geneva, and a bunch of other towns and cities across Europe. And I sold that business to Comcast a number of years ago before going on to, well, I did a few other things. I had a cable TV business as well, and then founded Rivada. But you said you're from the Consumer Institute, and you just reminded me when you said that there's something that I didn't say. And that is that from a consumer standpoint, American consumers in particular should want to see wholesale in America. America and Canada have some of the world's highest mobile data prices. It's disgusting what Americans are being charged for mobile connectivity. It's about double what people are paying in the UK, and the UK is expensive, about 5 times what consumers are paying in Germany. This is a country that has cheap fuel, cheap food, cheap clothing, cheap everything else except wireless data. Now that tells you something. When you are paying the highest mobile data prices in the world, when American consumers, out of every home in America, a significant chunk, especially for poorer people, of their monthly budget is going out and paying for wireless data services, more than $50 a month going out from households, and the average is actually much higher than that. It's a 40% reduction in the average price of wireless connectivity in America, mobility, would be the equivalent of a $1 trillion tax cut.
If you want to hear more about this and more discussion about this, I recommend to you a book that just was published by Thomas Philippon called The Great Reversal, Why Free Markets Fail in America. It's a very interesting discussion, both not just about wireless rates and internet rates, but also about these problems. Or you can read my review of the book, which came out. Why are you all laughing? Well, you can read my review. It came out in the Wall Street Journal about a week ago, as a matter of fact, which also summarizes that. And as for myself, my last comment on this is that, no, I don't build networks, I just work them. That's an inside Washington joke, by the way. It's been a really good discussion, don't you think?
Yeah. Thank you.
And great questions, too. Thank you very much. Thank you, Declan.
Thank you, Arthur.